take you guys through a quick repair video on my friend's Diamondback recoil comp. Now, he was riding the other day and he actually found that the front end got really sketchy. And what's actually happening is there's either some looseness in his headset or some looseness in his fork that's really giving it a lot of slop. And this thing is really knocking around. Listen to this. Now, I don't know if you can hear that, but this thing is loose as a goose, and it is definitely not safe to ride. So let's get into this thing and let's figure out what the heck's going on. So the first thing you'll notice when you look at this particular issue is how loose the fork is coming through the head tube. Now when you hold the brake and you move it, you can actually see, look how much slop there is in that headset. Now when you look right here, there should be almost no movement here. It should just be, capable of turning, but this stuff should not move at all. So that suggests to me that either the bearings are worn out or maybe damaged, or even potentially we just need to put a little bit more pressure on this top cap with the stem loose to just kind of tighten everything up and snug it up a bit. So let's give that a try first, and if that doesn't fix it, we'll pull it apart and see what's going on inside. As with most modern bikes, this one's equipped with 5mm bolts that clamp the stem onto the fork, as well as a 5mm bolt and this top cap that just helps pull pressure down on everything. So to add a little bit more pressure, what we're going to do is we're going to loosen the stem, tighten this up, and then reclamp the stem, and we're going to see if we can take all that slop out of that headset. So first things first, all you got to do is break those 5mm bolts loose from the stem, and once the stem is loosened up, you can simply come up here to the top with your 5mm and just tighten. And this, wow, that actually has a lot of movement. Wow, look at that. I got quite a bit, probably 3/4 of a turn on that before it really bottomed out. So I'm just going to test it bottomed out. We obviously don't want to leave it all the way tightened because that can cause some premature wear as well. But I just want to see if that took the slop out of it. So let's check this out. Wow, that really tightened things up. But it feels really rough. I'm thinking we might have a bearing dead. So let's get inside this thing and let's have a look. Let's see what it actually looks like on the inside. The nice thing about this bike is it's really easy to get this whole headset apart. So the first thing you got to do if you want to get into your headset, and this really applies to any modern bike, is just loosen your stem, break those bolts loose, and once those are loose, take this top cap bolt out. Now you're going to have to go all the way out with it. So it'll be tough the first turn and then it should come out fairly easily. Now this threads down into a star nut that actually sits on the inside of your fork tube, and in some certain situations it can actually get crushed or squished or even really loose inside there to where it won't tighten anymore, and then you actually have to go through and knock it out and replace it. In this case, that doesn't seem to be an issue. As you can see, our wheel is turning, so we are loose. We can go ahead and pull our stem and our bars off. Now, once those are removed, you simply take these spacers, and this one's got several, and you remove those. And then just below the spacers, and this is critical, is this little wedge piece. Now, this is a little conical wedge, and it sits down in there, and it just helps to apply pressure evenly to the bearings inside your headset while this thing is being used. Now that we've got that wedge removed, the next step is to take the race and the dust shield out, and these should be extra loose. These ones actually came loose when I was pulling that shield off, and they come off in one piece, but it's actually a two-piece. So this is a hardened metal race, and this is just a plastic dust shield. Once you've got those removed, you can set them aside, and then what we need to do is we actually need to inspect this bearing in here just to make sure it's not worn. And right out of the gate I can see that there appears to be some material in there, so I've got a small hook tool. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop that bearing up out of there, and we're going to have a look closer just to see what's going on. And the bearing, you might need to push forward just a bit just to take some pressure off from the fork. The bearing will pop right out of there. Oh yeah, so look at this. I don't know if you guys can see this, but there's all these little flakes of some kind of material. See that on my finger? Yeah, this thing's all, oh, it's got all kinds of it in there. So I'm thinking this bearing might be wiped out. Let's actually pull the fork. Let's look at the bottom bearing, and we may just be we may just be replacing this bearing as long as that race seems to be okay. Once we're at this point and that top bearing is out, it's actually really easy to remove the fork. Now, don't forget that your brake line is running down onto the fork, so you can only go so far with it without disconnecting your brake line either from the caliper, from the bars, or actually physically removing the brake lever or the caliper. Now, to pull the fork, all you're going to do is you're going to lift up on the frame, and you'll actually see the fork slides right on out. And when you get the fork out, what we're looking at is this particular bearing right here. So we're going to go ahead and pull that out as well. We're going to set it down with the other one just to make sure that it's not destroyed too. So as you see, I've got our bearings sitting up here on the bench, and I've gone ahead and wiped them down real quick just to remove some of the grease. And what I really want you guys to see is this material here, these little black specks. What this looks like it is there's actually a coating on the races in the frame, and it looks like that coating just wasn't cleaned off all the way before our first assembly, and it's just kind of flaking off. The races themselves actually look to be in pretty good shape. The bearing, although it doesn't appear to be heavily damaged, it does feel a little bit rough when I roll the balls between my fingers. So I'm going to go ahead and replace these two bearings. We're going to re-grease, reassemble everything, and we're going to see how it does. We've got our new bearings here, and the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to grease them. Now, I like using a real high-quality grease, something that's meant specifically for headset usage, and I typically go with this Dualco or Dualco, however you say it. It tends to work really well. Now, I actually load up a grease gun with it. However, you can do this by hand too. And simply what you're going to do is you're going to want to get grease onto all of the surfaces of the bearing, and I just kind of work it on all the way around. Once I've got it on, go to the other one, get grease on all the way around. And the nice thing with this grease gun is you can just be a little more precise. However, doing it by hand works fine too. Now what we're going to do is you're just going to take the bearing, you're going to work that grease up into the cage, and you really want to get it on every single surface. Now don't worry, we're definitely going to add some more, but this is just kind of the starting process. And basically just get it worked in there really well. Once you've got those bearings greased, the next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to grease your lower race. Now you've got a dust shield here too, so make sure that's set down below the race, and take your grease and just fill that race up and really, do a good job. Obviously don't do it so that it's going to come spraying out of there once you pressurize it and torque everything back down, but make sure it's got a really good coating on there. And then I just kind of work it in by hand. Try not to smear it too much, but just kind of smooth it out so that your bearing has a nice greased surface once you get in there. Once that's greased, you're going to take your bearing, and it's very important. So the cage, you always want the cage to be facing away from the conical portion of your race. So you'll know definitely when you put it in if it's backwards, because it's not going to move very smoothly. So anyways, the free side goes down towards the race, the cage side goes away from the race. So we're going to go ahead and set that on our lower, and now we're ready to go ahead and set our fork back into our frame. So to put our fork back in, it's pretty simple. Now one thing you need to make sure is the crown on your fork should curve forward. So you'll see you've got this curvature to it. It should curve forward, not backward. If it's backward, then you've got the whole front wheel on backwards. What you're going to do is you're just going to lift up on your frame. You're going to set the fork through the head tube there and just gently set it down in place. And that should be all you need to do to get the fork in. Now obviously we've still got to put our top bearing in and just reassemble everything here. Our next step is to put our top bearing in, but before we do that, we want to make sure this cup is really well greased. So we're going to go ahead and just give it some greasing, and we want to get it all over the bearing surface just to make sure that bearing is well lubricated. Okay, that's pretty good. Now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to install our bearing, and don't forget, you want the cage side away from the cone, so actually down into the cup. So your open ball bearing section should be facing upwards here. So you're going to to set it in. Just going to pull forward on the fork, and that'll set it down in place. Now we can get our race here and our dust shield here. And you actually want to set the race inside the dust shield like this. Just make sure it's cleaned off, got no crud. And then we're going to take and we're going to set it right down in place. We're just going to rock the fork forward again, and that race will sit down into the bearing. And now we're ready to go back together with the top. Alright, if you've made it this far, awesome, we're in the home stretch. So next step is going to be to put that wedge back down in there. It's just that plastic wedge, and it's going to go right down onto the fork and sit right inside of that race. Now, don't forget, we haven't torqued this down, so you may still have a little bit of awkward positioning, but once we get everything in place and we squeeze it, it's all going to align. So now that we've got that on, I'll wipe my hand off a bit. We're going to go ahead, we're going to take our bars. Now this is also important. Make sure that you've got all your cable and hose routing in the right position. If not, you may have to pull the fork back out just to get it to the correct side. But what we're going to do is we're going to set our spacers back in place. And those are just getting our bars to the right height. And we're going to set our bar down on top. And then last but not least, we're going to take that top cap with the bolt through it. We're going to set it down in place. And that's what we're going to use to actually bring this thing down and tight together. Now that we've got that in there and we've got it started, we're going to take our 5mm Allen, and we're actually just going to tighten that down, and we're going to get everything aligned here. Now, don't be too concerned about the positioning of the bars yet. What we want to do is we want to seat the bearings and the races first, and then we'll worry about making our finite adjustments. And I usually go down really tight to the point where the fork is near locked in place, and then I slowly back out about an 1/8 turn, 1/4 turn, and usually that feels, oh yeah, that feels nice. Maybe actually just a little bit more, just to take that pressure off. Okay, feels good. Now all we've got to do is get our bars aligned with our wheel properly here. That looks pretty good. We're going to go ahead and we're going to tighten down the stem using that same 5mm. So we have successfully installed a new set of bearings in our headset on this bike. And man, I gotta tell you, this thing feels so much smoother, so much nicer, and even better, there's absolutely no play in this headset anymore. So I'm gonna go ahead and consider this bike fixed. I'm gonna get it back to the owner, and hopefully they can take it out and ride and have fun. As always, I appreciate you guys stopping by and checking out the video. If you liked what you saw, please go ahead and give me a subscribe. At that same rate, if you've got any comments, questions, or suggestions for additional videos, go ahead and throw them down in that comment section. Thanks again.